Honestly, there are 7 people I have never and will never forgive. Not just for one thing, but for a long chain of betrayals. They know exactly who they are, and so do I.
Everyone thinks the great Beatles rivalry was between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the brooding artist versus the pop craftsman. It's a story that's practically baked into music history. But what if that story is wrong? The most bitter, most consequential, and most creatively charged feud wasn't the one in the spotlight. It was the one simmering just beneath the surface. A conflict that festered in the shadows between the group's quiet youngest member and its relentless driving force. This is the story of how Paul McCartney's control pushed George Harrison to his absolute breaking point, and how that same pressure cooker of a partnership ultimately fueled one of the greatest solo albums of all time. This wasn't just a spat between bandmates, it was a struggle for identity, a fight for creative oxygen, and the real reason the Beatles had to die for George Harrison to truly live. To really get the animosity that would define their relationship, you have to go back to a school bus in Liverpool. 1954. This is where a 12-year-old Paul McCartney first met an 11-year-old George Harrison. They hit it off instantly, bonding over a shared obsession with American rock and roll. Paul, always the connector, was the one who brought George into John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen. But right from the start, a subtle power dynamic was locked in place. Paul was a year older, which in the world of teenagers might as well be a lifetime. Lennon was even hesitant to let the younger Harrison join, thinking he was just a kid. But Paul vouched for his friend, and George's raw talent on the guitar eventually won everyone over. In those early days, crammed into a van or sharing rooms in the gritty clubs of Hamburg, they were incredibly close. More than bandmates, they were brothers, all chasing the same wild dream. But Paul often called George his little baby brother, a nickname that seemed affectionate, but also hinted at a dynamic that would later become a huge source of friction. George felt that even when they were grown men with wives and lives of their own, Paul still saw him through that same lens, as the kid brother who was always a year younger and a step behind. This little brother dynamic bled directly into their creative process. The Beatles were an unspoken hierarchy. John and Paul were the leaders, the songwriters. Ringo was the steady heartbeat, and George was their secret weapon, the lead guitarist whose licks were absolutely essential to their sound. Tom Petty once said that George was responsible for many of their most iconic guitar parts, from the delicate beauty of "And I Love Her" to the driving rock of their early hits. But being the secret weapon isn't the same as being the general. For years, George was mostly content in his role, but as his own songwriting began to bloom, he kept hitting a wall. And more often than not, that wall's name was Paul McCartney. The Lennon-McCartney partnership wasn't just a brand, it was a fortress, and George was on the outside looking in. He once complained that he'd have to wait for John and Paul to get through 10 of their songs before they'd even consider one of his. This wasn't just in his head. On most Beatles albums, George was lucky to get 1 or 2 tracks. The unspoken message was clear. Your songs are good, George, but they're not Lennon-McCartney good. For a burgeoning artist, it was a slow, soul-crushing kind of creative suffocation. The whole dynamic inside the Beatles shifted for good on August 27, 1967. That was the day their manager, Brian Epstein, died. Epstein wasn't just their manager. He was their anchor, the one person who could wrangle for massive personalities. With him gone, a power vacuum opened up, and Paul McCartney stepped right into it. Now, you could argue Paul's intentions were good. He saw his band drifting apart and figured the only way to save it was to give it direction and keep the train on the tracks. He dreamed up ambitious projects like SGT, Pepper, and Magical Mystery Tour to keep the momentum going. But what Paul saw as leadership, George started to see as control. What Paul meant as guidance, George felt as condescension. The studio, once a creative playground, became a tense office. Paul, a musical genius, had a very specific vision for how every song should sound, which often meant he dictated parts to the others. While John Lennon could usually hold his own against Paul, George found it harder and harder. The little brother was now being treated like a session musician in his own band. Even Ringo Starr quit for a brief time during the White Album sessions because he felt so criticized and sidelined by Paul's intense direction. For George, this was especially tough to take. His own songwriting was exploding. He was writing tracks like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, an undeniable masterpiece. Yet, he struggled to get his bandmates, especially Paul, to take it seriously. It was only when he brought his friend, Eric Clapton, into the studio to play the solo that the others finally snapped to attention. Imagine how that felt. It was a painful confirmation of his deepest insecurity, that his own talent wasn't enough to earn their respect. He had to bring in an outsider to validate his art. This period was just one musical slight after another. Paul would sometimes flat out replace George's guitar solos with his own, like on Another Girl. George would bring in a new song, only to be met with a lukewarm response. He talked about it years later, explaining the issue wasn't personal. outside the studio, but a total creative clash within it. He said, "You'd have to do 59 of Paul's songs before he'd even listen to one of yours." He even went so far as to say that Paul had ruined him as a guitar player, not because Paul was bad, but because the constant second-guessing had completely shattered his confidence. The resentment was building, becoming a low hum beneath the surface of the world's most beloved music. By January 1969, the cracks in the Beatles were gaping wounds. In an effort to get back to their roots, Paul pushed for a new project. They would write and rehearse a new album, all while being filmed for a documentary. The project, eventually released as Let It Be, was supposed to heal them. Instead, it became a complete disaster. The setting, Twickenham Film Studios, was cold and sterile, nothing like the cozy vibe of Abbey Road. The ever-present cameras magnified every ounce of tension. This environment became a pressure cooker, and the main conflict, caught on film for the whole world to see, was between Paul and George. The footage is a raw, uncomfortable look at a creative partnership dying in real time. Paul, as the acting, musical director, is constantly pushing, prodding, and instructing. George, whose patience has worn paper-thin, is visibly annoyed. The most infamous moment comes during a rehearsal for Two of Us. Paul, unhappy with what George is playing, starts micromanaging his guitar part. George, his voice dripping with sarcasm, finally snaps. "I'll play whatever you want me to play," he says, his eyes cold. "Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It's a devastating surrender from a man who has given up trying to be heard. The final straw came on January 10, 1969. After another tense morning, George Harrison had enough. There was no big shouting match. During the lunch break, he just quietly packed up his guitar, turned to the others, and said, "I'm leaving the band now. See you round the clubs." He went home and wrote in his diary, got up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed until lunchtime, left the Beatles, went home. The others were stunned. As seen in the Get Back documentary, John Lennon, in a bit of dark humor, immediately suggests getting Eric Clapton to replace him. Then, in a moment that perfectly captured the dysfunction, they launch into a chaotic jam session, with Yoko Ono grabbing George's mic and letting out a primal scream. The quiet Beatle had finally been silenced, and all that was left in his place was noise. The day George Harrison quit the Beatles wasn't just an act of frustration, it was an act of freedom. He left the stifling atmosphere of Twickenham and immediately poured all that raw emotion into his music. During his 5-day walkout, he wrote a new song. It was loud, chaotic, and brimming with angry relief. He called it Wah Wah. The title was a brilliant double-edged sword. On one level, it's the guitar pedal he loved. But on a deeper, more personal level, it was a direct shot at the immense headache his bandmates were giving him. As he put it, "You're giving me a bloody headache." The lyrics were a furious declaration of independence from the insincere, draining politics of the band. And while he was frustrated with John's disengagement too, the core of that wah-wah was the endless, overbearing creative direction from Paul McCartney. George was gone for 5 days. A meeting was held, and the others, including a humbled Paul, agreed to his terms. No more Twickenham, and no big public concert. He agreed to return, but everything had changed. He wasn't the little brother anymore. He was a man who knew his own worth and was willing to walk away. The bitterness echoed long after the band split. John Lennon famously recruited George to play that snarling slide guitar on his anti-McCartney anthem, How Do You Sleep? George's participation sent a pretty clear message at the time. Playing on that track must have felt like a release, a way to vicariously say everything he'd been bottling up for years. He also embedded his own critiques into his solo work. Beyond the fury of Wah Wah, the song Run-of-the-Mill from his All Things Must Pass album is a sorrowful post-mortem on their fractured friendships. The title is a play on an Old English phrase, trouble at Taymill, meaning trouble at the factory, a clear nod to the squabbles at Apple Cores. Lyrics like "You got me wondering how I lost your friendship, but I see it in your eyes" are widely seen as being about Paul, a lament for a bond broken by ego and control. For years, George Harrison felt creatively constipated, his own word for it. He had a mountain of songs that had been rejected or ignored by the Lennon-McCartney powerhouse. When the Beatles finally broke up in 1970, the floodgates blew wide open. In November of that year, he released All Things Must Pass, a massive, magnificent triple album. That was the ultimate statement of his talent. It was a staggering artistic achievement that took the world by storm. The lead single, My Sweet Lord, shot to #1 in both the US and the UK, the first solo track by any ex-Beatle to conquer both sides of the Atlantic. That had to feel good. All Things Must Pass was more than an album. It was George's vindication. It was stone-cold proof that the quiet Beatle had been sitting on a goldmine of genius all along. Songs that weren't deemed good enough for the Beatles, like the title track, Isn't It a Pity? And Run-of-the-Mill, were now being hailed as masterpieces. The sheer quality and quantity of the music was a silent rebuke to years of being Sidelined, he'd been told his songs were secondary, and now his solo debut was outselling and outshining the initial solo work of his former bandmates. Paul McCartney himself later admitted it was easy to underestimate George's songwriting. He acknowledged that when George blossomed, he wrote some of the greatest songs ever. It was a long overdue admission. In a secretly recorded 1969 conversation, Paul had told John this year his songs are at least as good as ours, a backhanded compliment that George rightly dismissed, pointing out that many of those new songs were actually years old. All Things Must Pass was the evidence. It was a monument to suppressed talent finally unleashed. The story of George Harrison and Paul McCartney isn't a simple tale of hate. It's way more complicated, a story of brotherhood, rivalry, and deep frustration, born from a desperate need for artistic respect. It was a clash between Paul's need to steer the ship and George's need to finally find his own voice. And while the bitterness of the breakup was very real, time eventually did its thing. In the decades that followed, they reconnected. First, for the anthology project, and then just as old friends who had shared a journey no one else on earth could ever understand. In George's final days, as he battled cancer, Paul was there. They held hands and found a measure of peace. Today, Paul McCartney speaks of George with a profound affection. He tells a story about a fir tree George once gave him. He planted it at his home, and now, he says he often stops and talks to the tree, saying, "Hi George." It's his way of keeping his baby brother's spirit alive. The feud may have been the battle that broke the Beatles, but it was also the fire that forged George Harrison. It pushed him out of the nest and forced him to fly. And in the end, he soared, leaving behind a legacy of music that stands as a powerful testament to the quiet Beatle who finally, and resoundingly, made himself heard. What do you think? Was Paul's leadership essential, or was his control the very thing that tore them apart? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories you thought you knew. Thanks for watching.